The cold iron of the shackles bit into Grace's wrists like sharp blades, but she held her head high as the guards led her through the main hall of the courthouse. Each step echoed against the stone walls like a hammer on an anvil, marking the rhythm of her racing heart. The air was thick with tension and expectation. Familiar faces lined the walls, merchants, landowners, and farmers who had travelled for miles to witness what they all knew was more than a simple trial. It was a spectacle of power, a demonstration of how the world dealt with those who dared to challenge the established order. Andrew Blackmoor stood near the judge's bench, impeccably dressed, his controlled smile not quite hiding the tension in his eyes. Beside him, Stephen Miller arranged documents with the precision of a man who had turned the law into a personal weapon. Both radiated the confidence of predators who had cornered their prey and were merely waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Grace took a deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of fear in her mouth, but also something stronger, the iron-willed determination of a woman who had lost everything except the chance to fight for justice. In a leather satchel, tied discreetly beneath her torn skirt, her father's papers waited like bombs about to explode. Her eyes scanned the crowd for a specific face, for the brown eyes that had promised never to abandon her. Daniel wasn't visible, but she could feel his presence somewhere nearby, an anchor in the storm that was about to break over their heads. "Miss Grace Rosehill," Stephen Miller announced, his voice cutting through the murmuring crowd, "appears before this court accused of fleeing from the law and for conduct unbecoming of her station." The words hung in the air like vultures waiting for a kill. Grace knew this moment would define not only her fate, but the future of any hope that love could triumph over manipulation, that truth could defeat an elaborately constructed lie. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the main entrance. Grace closed her eyes for an instant, gathering all the courage inherited from generations of ancestors who had governed with honor and prepared for the battle of her life. When she opened them again, there was something fierce and untamable in her gaze, the expression of a woman willing to burn the whole world down to protect the only true love she had ever known. The trial was about to begin, and with it, the chance to rewrite the destiny of two hearts that refused to surrender. The cold morning air cut Grace's face like invisible blades, but she remained motionless at the top of the stone steps, watching strangers carry out the last remnants of her life. The family crest, which for generations had adorned the main door of the manor house, lay shattered on the ground, its gilded fragments mixed with the mud trampled by indifferent boots. Her hands, once accustomed to the weight of precious rings, now clenched into bare fists, her nails digging into her palms until they left crescent-shaped marks. The dark dress she wore was the only one left untouched by the merciless inventory of the federal marshals. Not even her mother's jewels, kept like sacred relics, had escaped the brutal confiscation. "Ma'am, you need to move," one of the men growled, shoving her roughly. The push made her stumble, and for a terrible moment, Grace felt the world spin. It wasn't just the physical imbalance that shook her, but the sharp awareness that no one saw her as the lady of the manor anymore. To these men, she was just an obstacle to be removed, an inconvenient figure standing between them and their orders. It was then that a firm, calloused hand reached out to her. Grace looked up and met a face she didn't know, but one that carried something rare in those dark days: genuine respect. The man was tall, with broad shoulders shaped by years of military training, and he wore the simple, sturdy clothes of a soldier with no crest of his own. His brown eyes held her with an intensity that wasn't invasive, but protective. "So allow me to help you, ma'am," he said, his deep voice carrying a courtesy Grace hadn't heard in weeks. For a moment, wounded pride screamed at her to refuse. To accept help there, in front of all those witnessing her ruin, would be like admitting her final defeat. But there was something in the steadiness of his gaze that reassured her, a silent promise that her dignity would not be tarnished by the gesture. Grace extended a trembling hand and felt his calloused fingers wrap around hers with unexpected gentleness. The touch was warm, real, human in a world that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of those words. "Thank you," she murmured, allowing him to help her regain her balance. "Daniel Ashford, ma'am, at your service." The name echoed in her mind but sparked no memories. He wasn't one of the men from the capital she knew, nor one of the wealthy landowners who frequented the manor in its glory days. He was someone ordinary, born of humble stock, who had risen on his own merit on the battlefield. "Grace Rosehill," she replied automatically, before realizing the bitter irony. Rosehill no longer belonged to her. Daniel's eyes softened, as if he understood exactly what was going through her mind. "To me, ma'am, you'll always be the Lady of Rosehill," he said in a low voice just for her to hear. The words struck her like an unexpected balm, warming something in her chest she had thought was dead forever. It had been so long since she had heard her family name spoken with genuine reverence, without the mocking tone that had become constant in recent weeks. Around them, the spectacle of public humiliation continued. Tapestries that told her family's history were rolled up carelessly. Furniture carved by master craftsmen was carried out like common objects. Each piece removed took with it a fragment of her identity, a part of who she had been before the world fell apart. "The townspeople are watching," Daniel murmured, indicating with a discreet nod the groups forming in the distance. Grace followed his gaze and saw familiar faces marked with concern. There was Martin, the blacksmith who had forged the first iron toys of her childhood; Eleanor, the woman who had helped birth half the children in the county; Thomas, the old rancher who had known her grandfather. They all watched her with a mixture of sadness and helplessness, wanting to help but knowing they were powerless against the forces destroying her. "They respect you," Daniel continued. "No one can take that from you." Grace felt her throat tighten. It was true. Even stripped of land and title, she still commanded the loyalty of those she had governed with justice and compassion. In recent years, especially after her father's death, she had taken on responsibilities that went beyond formal administration. She knew every family in the county by name, remembered the children's birthdays, and intervened personally when debts became too heavy. "That's little comfort when you've lost everything," she answered, her voice laced with bitterness. "Perhaps, ma'am, but it's more than many wealthy men achieve in a lifetime." There was a cutting truth in his words. Grace knew plenty of landowners who cared only for profits and appearances, who saw farmers as numbers in a ledger. She had never been like that. Her father had raised her to see responsibility where others saw only privilege. A harsh shout cut through the air. One of the marshals was barking orders for the last items to be removed before noon. The urgency was unnecessary, but it served to humiliate her further, turning the farewell to her ancestral home into a rushed and brutal spectacle. "Where will you stay?" Daniel asked, genuine concern in his voice. Grace hesitated. The truth was, she didn't know. There was a small property on the edge of the old estate, a stone cottage where she sometimes went when she needed quiet. It was all that was left to her by the court's decree, a minimal concession so she wouldn't starve or freeze. "There's a small house gone," she began, but her voice failed her. "I know the place," Daniel said. "I can escort you there if you'll allow me." Grace stared at him in surprise. There was no court order for him to do this. No master had sent him to protect her. It was a spontaneous offer, born of a courtesy she thought had vanished from the world. "Why would you do that?" she asked, genuinely curious. Daniel was silent for a moment, as if searching for the right words. When he spoke, it was with the simplicity of a man who had learned to be honest by necessity. "Because it's the right thing to do, ma'am." The answer was too simple and too profound at the same time. In a world driven by interests and alliances, Daniel was offering something that had become rare, an act of kindness with no expectation of reward. The last of the furniture was carried out. The house that had been her home her entire life was now empty, echoing with the hollowness of bare walls. Grace felt her chest tighten again, but this time something was different. She wasn't completely alone. "I accept your escort, Sir Daniel," she said, lifting her chin with a dignity that even ruin couldn't break. He inclined his head respectfully, and in that simple gesture Grace glimpsed something she no longer expected to find: hope. The stone cottage seemed even smaller than Grace remembered, its damp walls reflecting the weak light filtering through the small windows. The low ceiling made her feel oppressed, yet at the same time offered an intimate refuge from the hostile world outside. It was here she would now have to rebuild a life she had thought was lost forever. Daniel had personally carried the few trunks she had left, setting them down carefully in the main room. His movements were precise, respectful, as if each object were a sacred relic instead of the simple belongings of a fallen heiress. "The firewood is dry," he said, kneeling before the hearth to light the fire, "and there's a small supply of grain in the shed. It's not much, but it should last you a few weeks." Grace watched him work, fascinated by the natural competence with which he performed tasks she had never imagined a soldier doing. His hands, accustomed to a rifle, handled kindling and embers with the same dexterity a craftsman would use on his raw materials. "You don't have to do this," she murmured, aware that she was asking too much of a man she barely knew. "Yes, I do, ma'am," he replied, not taking his eyes off the fire that was beginning to catch. "A man who doesn't protect those in need isn't worth his salt." There was such solid conviction in his voice that Grace felt something stir inside her. It had been a long time since she had heard someone speak of honor so genuinely, without ulterior motives or political calculations. The flames licked at the dry wood, and soon the fireplace crackled with a welcoming warmth. Daniel stood wiping his hands on his trousers, and for the first time, Grace could observe him more closely. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps a few years older than her. There were small scars on his hands and forearms, marks of countless hours of training and real battles. "Where are you from, Daniel?" she asked, sitting in one of the simple chairs around the small table. He hesitated for a moment, as if the question had caught him off guard. "Nowhere important, ma'am. My father was a private until he died in battle. My mother sewed for pennies. I earned my rank because a commanding officer saw me fight and thought I was worth the investment." The raw honesty of his answer surprised her. In the capital, origins were always embellished with glorious stories, invented lineages, exaggerated connections. Daniel spoke of his life as if recounting simple facts, with neither shame nor excessive pride. "And why did you decide to help me today?" Grace pressed, driven by a genuine curiosity. Daniel walked to the window and stood in silence for a long moment, looking out at the fields that stretched beyond the cottage. When he finally spoke, it was without turning to her. "Because I've seen powerful men crush the weak just for sport. And I've seen common people do extraordinary things when no one expected it. You're different from what I imagined a woman of your standing would be." "Different how?" "I saw how the townspeople looked at you. It wasn't fear or submission. It was real affection. You don't earn that with just titles or wealth." Grace felt her chest tighten again, but this time it was a good ache, like muscles moving again after a long time. It had been so long since she had felt truly seen, understood beyond the appearances and social roles that defined her. "My father taught me that to govern is to serve," she said, her low voice filled with longing. "That our duty was to protect those who depended on us, not to exploit that dependence." He was a wise man. He was a man who died in debt, trying to maintain that philosophy in a world that considers it naive. Daniel finally turned to face her, and his brown eyes shone with an intensity that made her heart beat a little faster. "Maybe the world is wrong, ma'am." The simplicity of the sentence completely disarmed her. It was exactly what she thought, but had never dared to say out loud. Hearing those words from someone she had met only hours before felt both impossible and inevitable. A noise from outside interrupted the moment. Daniel immediately moved between her and the door, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm at his hip. Grace felt a mix of gratitude and concern as she realized how unhesitatingly he protected her. "It's just children," she said, recognizing the sound of young laughter. Daniel relaxed slightly but didn't abandon his protective stance. Through the window, they could see 3 children from the town playing near the cottage, seemingly more curious than threatening. "They always came here when I needed quiet to think," Grace explained, a sad smile touching her lips. "They knew I kept candies for them in the pantry. And now I have no candies to offer. I have almost nothing to offer." Daniel studied her for a moment, then did something that completely surprised her. He took a small leather pouch from his belt and held it out to her. "It's not much, but it should be enough to buy some sweets in town." Grace looked at the pouch, uncomprehending. "I can't take your money." "It's not money, ma'am, it's an investment." "In what?" "In proving that kindness is still worth something in this world." The answer left her speechless. Grace took the pouch with trembling hands, feeling the modest weight of the coins inside. It was little money in practical terms, but it represented so much more. It was the possibility of still being who she had always been, even stripped of all the external symbols of her identity. "Why are you doing this for me?" she asked, genuinely perplexed. Daniel walked to the door and opened it, letting the children's laughter fill the room. "Because someone has to, ma'am, and because you remind me why I wanted to be a man of honor in the first place." He left the cottage before she could reply, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the growing warmth spreading through her chest. Through the window, Grace saw him approach the children, kneel to their level and whisper something that sent them running toward town, shouting with joy. When they returned a few minutes later, they were carrying small candies they had evidently just bought. Daniel led them to the cottage door and made a respectful gesture toward Grace. "The Lady of Rosehill would like to greet you," he said solemnly. The children bowed awkwardly, and Grace felt tears burn her eyes. On a day when she had lost everything that defined her identity, a stranger had given her back the most important thing, the ability to be who she had always chosen to be. That afternoon, as she handed out candies to smiling children, Grace understood that perhaps ruin wasn't the end of her story. but the beginning of something entirely new. 2 weeks passed since Grace had settled into the stone cottage, and the routine that developed between her and Daniel had a surreally domestic quality. He appeared every morning, always with a practical excuse, to check if the firewood was dry, to examine the locks, to bring news from town. But Grace was beginning to suspect his motives went far beyond simple courtesy. That October morning she found him fixing a loose board on the shed, his shirt damp with sweat, despite the chill that heralded the coming winter. His movements were economical, precise, and there was a concentration on his face that revealed genuine pride in a job well done. "You didn't have to bother," she said, approaching with a mug of hot coffee. Daniel looked up and smiled, a smile that lit up his entire face and did something strange to Grace's stomach. "Actually, I did, ma'am. The wood was about to rot, and that would attract rats." She handed him the coffee, and when their fingers brushed accidentally, they both felt an electric current that lasted only a second but seemed to echo for much longer. Daniel pulled his hand back quickly, as if he'd been burned. "Thank you," he murmured, avoiding her gaze. Grace realized something had changed between them. What had begun as an act of chivalry was turning into something more dangerous, more intimate. And she didn't know if she had the right to want it, stripped as she was of everything that defined her as a suitable woman for a respectable marriage. "Daniel," she began, but was cut off by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They both turned toward the road and saw 3 riders heading for the cottage. Grace immediately recognized the brand on their saddles. They belonged to Andrew Blackmoor, the tycoon who had always shown an interest in her family's lands, and, rumor whispered, in her. Daniel instinctively moved in front of Grace, his hand going to his sidearm. His posture changed completely, transforming from the helpful handyman into the experienced warrior he truly was. "Miss Rosehill," said the rider leading the group, dismounting with the arrogance typical of wealthy men. "Mr. Blackmoor wishes to speak with you." "Mr. Blackmoor can schedule an appointment, like any civilized person," Grace replied, lifting her chin in a gesture Daniel had learned to recognize as a sign she would not be easily intimidated. The rider smirked, but there was no warmth in his expression. "I'm afraid it's not a request, Miss Rosehill. It's a summons." Daniel took a step forward, his presence seeming to fill the entire space between Grace and the unwanted visitors. "The Lady of Rosehill is not obliged to obey a summons from anyone but the governor himself," he said, his low voice carrying an authority that surprised even Grace. "And who are you to speak for her?" the rider retorted, looking Daniel up and down with obvious disdain. "I don't see a family brand on you. I am Daniel Ashford, a veteran of the Union Army, and I am in the lady's service of my own free will." The tension in the air became almost palpable. Grace could feel the danger gathering like storm clouds, and knew she had to act before the situation exploded into violence. "I will speak with Mr. Blackmoor," she said, stepping forward, "but on neutral ground, at the town chapel, where any conversation will be public and witnessed." The rider hesitated, clearly not expecting this counter-proposal. "Mr. Blackmoor wishes for privacy to discuss sensitive matters." "Then, Mr. Blackmoor can choose between privacy and my presence," Grace replied with a coolness that made Daniel smile inwardly with pride. After a few minutes of whispered deliberation, the riders agreed to her terms. They would arrange the meeting for the next day at noon in the small stone chapel that served the local community. When they left, Grace felt her legs weaken slightly. Daniel immediately came to her side, offering his arm for support. "Are you all right, ma'am?" "I am," she answered, though her voice trembled slightly. I didn't expect him to act so quickly." "What kind of man is this Andrew?" Grace sighed deeply, letting herself lean on Daniel's firm arm as they walked back to the cottage. "Intelligent, ambitious, rich. Before I lost everything, my father rejected 3 of his marriage proposals. Andrew was always very polite, very proper, but there was something in his eyes that made me uncomfortable." "Something like what?" "As if he saw me not as a person, but as a desirable acquisition, as if I were a rare painting he wanted to hang in his main hall to impress visitors." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her fully. There was something in his eyes that made Grace's heart race. "You are no one's possession," he said, his voice thick with an intensity that made her momentarily forget to breathe. "You are an extraordinary woman who deserves to be loved for who she is, not for what she represents." The words hung between them like a veiled confession, charged with meanings neither of them dared to name openly. Grace felt her face flush and looked away, aware that she was treading on dangerous ground. "Daniel, she began, but was interrupted again. This time it was by a familiar figure walking up the road toward the cottage. Martin, the old blacksmith who had known her since she was a child, was approaching with hurried steps, his face etched with worry. "Miss Rosehill," he said, bowing respectfully, "I need to warn you. There are rumors spreading through town." "What rumors, Martin?" The man cast a nervous glance at Daniel before continuing. "They say Mr. Blackmoor plans to make you a public proposal, and that he won't take no for an answer." Grace felt the blood run cold in her veins. A public proposal would be impossible to refuse without causing a scandal, and a scandal was exactly the kind of weapon Andrew could use to force her to accept his terms. "There's more," Martin continued, visibly uncomfortable. "They're also saying he's questioning the propriety of having a young man so close to you, that it's not suitable for a single woman of your standing." Daniel stiffened beside Grace, and she could feel the anger radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "Thank you for the warning, Martin," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. When the blacksmith left, Grace and Daniel stood in silence for a long moment. The reality of their precarious situation had returned with full force, reminding them that their world was still far from safe. "Maybe I should leave," Daniel said finally, his voice low and pained. "My presence is making things complicated for you." Grace turned to him so quickly she almost lost her balance. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice low but fierce. "Don't you dare abandon me now. You are the only good thing left in my life, Daniel Ashford. If you leave, I don't know how I'll face this alone." The confession tumbled from her lips before she could contain it, raw and vulnerable. Daniel stared at her with an expression that mixed surprise, tenderness, and something deeper that made her heart beat even faster. "Then I won't leave, ma'am," he said, reaching out to touch her arm lightly. "No matter what Blackmoor says or does, I'll be here." In that simple promise, Grace found the strength she needed to face what was coming. But as she watched the sun set over the fields that were once hers, she knew the battle for her freedom was just beginning. The stone chapel seemed smaller than usual that day at noon, as if the walls had contracted to contain the tension hanging in the air. Grace had arrived with only Daniel, while Andrew had brought not only his riders, but also a thin man in fine clothes, whom she didn't immediately recognize. "Stephen Miller," the stranger introduced himself, bowing formally. "A judge from the state court at your service." Grace felt her stomach drop. The presence of a court official turned what she had hoped would be a conversation into something far more formal and dangerous. Daniel positioned himself slightly behind her, his presence as solid as a wall. Andrew was more elegant than ever, wearing clothes that must have cost more than many local families saw in a year. His brown hair was perfectly coiffed, and his smile was studied, calculated to convey charm and confidence. "Grace," he said, approaching with measured steps, "you look different, thinner. Adversity does not suit you." "Mr. Blackmoor," she replied curtly, not bothering with false pleasantries. "What do you want from me?" "Straight to the point," he laughed, but a coldness in his eyes betrayed the casual tone. "I've always admired that about you. Very well, I've come to offer a solution to your problems." Stephen Miller stepped forward, pulling a formal writ from his leather briefcase. "Miss Rosehill, as a representative of the state, it is my duty to inform you that your current situation is untenable. A woman of your standing cannot live indefinitely alone, without proper protection or guaranteed sustenance." Grace felt the trap closing around her, but maintained her upright posture. "I have adequate protection," she said, indicating Daniel with a subtle gesture. Andrew laughed openly. "You refer to this unlanded veteran?" "Grace, be reasonable. What real protection can a man who doesn't even own his own land offer?" Daniel took a step forward, but Grace stopped him with a look. She knew she had to fight this battle herself. "Mr. Ashford has served me with honor and competence," she said, emphasizing his name to make it clear she would not tolerate disrespect. "Ah, yes," Stephen Miller murmured, consulting his papers. "Daniel Ashford, son of an enlisted man promoted for military service. No property, no substantial income, no family name of note." Each word was delivered with the precision of a knife cutting flesh. Grace could see Daniel tense beside her, but admired how he maintained his control. "My worth is not measured by my heritage, but by my actions," Daniel said, his voice calm but filled with quiet authority. Of course," Andrew agreed with false magnanimity. "And do your actions include taking advantage of the vulnerability of a disgraced heiress?" The accusation was like a slap in the face. Grace felt fury explode in her chest, but Daniel was quicker. "Watch your words, sir," he said, his hand moving instinctively toward the Colt at his hip. "They may force me to answer them with steel." "Sir," Stephen Miller intervened smoothly, "threatening a man of Mr. Blackmoor's standing in the presence of a judge is a serious offense. I suggest you choose your words more carefully." Grace saw the trap complete itself. They were forcing Daniel into an impossible position. Either he silently accepted the slander, or he reacted and gave them the perfect pretext to arrest him. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting the air like a blade. "Mr. Blackmoor, if you came here only to insult my protector, you can save your time. Say what you want." Andrew smiled, pleased to have provoked the reaction he sought. "Very well, I am offering you marriage, Grace. My hand, my name, my protection. Together we can restore the dignity of your position and ensure the Rosehill lands are properly managed." "Under your control, you mean?" she retorted. "Under our shared supervision," Andrew corrected smoothly. "As husband and wife, as partners." Grace glanced at the writ Stephen Miller still held and realized there was more to come. "And if I refuse? Then I'm afraid we will have to proceed with the appropriate legal measures," the judge said, unrolling the document. "There are questions about the ownership of this cottage, about your ability to properly support yourself, about the propriety of your current living arrangement." The veiled threat was crystal clear. If she refused Andrew, they would find legal ways to make her life impossible, and Daniel's presence meant to be her protection was being turned into a weapon against her. "What kind of questions?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. "A single woman of your social standing living alone with a young man." Stephen Miller left the sentence hanging in the air, thick with sordid implications. "The court has a duty to protect morality and order. If there are suspicions of impropriety..." Grace felt the world spin. They were turning Daniel's kindness into a scandal, using his own honor as a weapon against them both. "There is no impropriety whatsoever," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "I'm sure there isn't," Andrew agreed with false sympathy. "But appearances matter, don't they? And appearances, well, they can be interpreted in various ways." Daniel remained motionless beside Grace, but she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from hot metal. She knew he was blaming himself, thinking that his presence was in fact complicating everything for her. "How long do I have to decide?" she finally asked. 3 days, Stephen Miller replied promptly. "After that, the court will take the necessary steps to resolve the situation. And if I accept the proposal, then all your problems disappear," Andrew said, taking a step closer. "Your honor will be restored, your social position secured, and your protector will be free to seek new employment in other territories." The message was clear. Accepting the marriage meant losing Daniel forever. Refusing meant dragging them both into even greater ruin. "I need time to consider," Grace said, tasting the bitter defeat in her mouth. "Naturally," Andrew agreed, formally kissing her hand. "Such an important decision deserves careful reflection." When they left, Grace remained motionless in the center of the empty chapel, hearing only the echo of her own heartbeat. Daniel approached slowly, as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt at any moment. "Grace," he said softly, using her name without the formal title for the first time. She turned to face him, and Daniel saw tears shining in her eyes. "They've won, haven't they?" she whispered. "No matter what I choose, they've won." Daniel reached out to touch her shoulders, hesitated, then did it anyway. The touch was gentle, comforting, filled with all the tenderness he couldn't express in words. "They haven't won yet," he said, his voice low but firm. "As long as you don't give up, they haven't won." Grace rested her forehead against his chest, allowing herself a moment of weakness in the arms of the only man who had made her feel safe in months. "How can I fight this, Daniel? How can I fight the law, the court, men who have all the power in the world?" Daniel gently held her chin, lifting her face so he could look into her eyes. "The same way you've been fighting all along," he said, "with courage, with dignity, by being exactly who you are, and you won't fight alone." The promise in his words warmed something inside Grace, but it also filled her with fear, because she knew that accepting his help meant risking the life of the man she was, against all logic and prudence, desperately falling in love with. Night fell on the stone cottage like a heavy shroud, laden with dark omens. Grace hadn't been able to eat more than a few spoonfuls of the simple stew Daniel had prepared, and he himself seemed to have lost his appetite completely. They both knew the next 3 days would define not only her future, but the fate of any chance at happiness they might build together. "You should leave," Grace said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched for hours. Now, tonight, before they find some way to arrest you. Daniel looked up from the cup of coffee he held between his hands, and Grace could see the suggestion had wounded him deeply. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. Daniel, be reasonable. If you stay, they'll destroy you too. And I couldn't live with myself if that happened. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring into the darkness outside. When he spoke, his voice was filled with an emotion she had never heard before. Do you think I could just leave? Abandon you when you need protection the most? What kind of man would that make me? A living one, she replied, her voice breaking slightly. A man with a future. Daniel turned to face her, and in the faint candlelight, Grace could see his eyes shining with an almost desperate intensity. My future is here, with you, he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. The silence that followed was charged with all the things that had gone unsaid between them. Grace felt her heart race until it felt like it would burst from her chest. Daniel, I know I have no right, he continued, approaching slowly. I know I'm just a man with no land, no name, nothing to offer but my heart, but I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just duty or courtesy. Grace stood, her legs trembling slightly. The distance between them felt both enormous and insignificant. Don't say that, she whispered. Not when we know it's impossible. Why is it impossible? Because I am an heiress, and you are a man who loves you, he finished, closing the distance between them. A man who would give his life to protect you. A man who sees in you not a title or a station, but the most extraordinary woman he has ever known. The words hit Grace like waves crashing against rocks. She closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. Even if I returned your feelings, she said, her voice barely a whisper, what could we do? Run? Live as outlaws? Would that be a life for either of us? Daniel reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I don't have the answers, Grace. I only know that a life without you wouldn't be a life at all. She opened her eyes and met his, so close she could feel his warm breath on her face. The moment stretched for an eternity, filled with possibilities and impossibilities. Daniel, she whispered, and there was as much desire as pain in her voice. He leaned in slightly, and for a terrible, wonderful instant, Grace thought he was going to kiss her. But a noise from outside made them break apart abruptly, as if waking from a dangerous dream. Heavy footsteps approached the cottage, accompanied by low voices. Daniel immediately moved in front of Grace, hand on his sidearm, all his warrior instincts on high alert. Who could that be at this hour? Grace murmured. Nothing good, Daniel answered, blowing out the candle to plunge the room into darkness. Through the cracks in the window shutter, they could see lanterns moving outside. There weren't many, maybe 3 or 4 men, but their presence in the middle of the night promised nothing positive. A firm knock on the door broke the silence. Miss Rosehill, called a voice she recognized as one of Andrew's men. We have orders to escort you to a safe location. Daniel and Grace exchanged a look of mutual understanding. It was an obvious lie. No one sent a security escort in the middle of the night without warning. What kind of orders? Grace called through the door, buying time. Orders from Judge Miller. There have been developments that require your immediate presence at the courthouse. Daniel moved closer to Grace and whispered in her ear. They've come to arrest you. They've probably invented some charge to justify forcing you into marriage as the only alternative to prison. Grace felt fear rise in her throat like bile, but forced herself to stay calm. Is there a way out the back? She whispered back. Yes, the bedroom window opens onto the garden. From there we can reach the woods. And then? Then we run. The simplicity of the answer both frightened and reassured her. To run meant admitting guilt, abandoning any chance of clearing her name, becoming an outlaw. But it also meant freedom. The knocking on the door grew more insistent. Miss Rosehill, if you don't open voluntarily, we'll be forced to enter. Daniel took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Trust me, he whispered. Grace looked into his eyes and saw the determination of a man willing to face the entire world to protect her. In that moment, the decision became simple. I do, she whispered back. They moved silently toward the back room, but not before Grace grabbed a small satchel with the few precious items she had left. Among them was her father's ring, the only heirloom she had managed to hide from the confiscations. When they reached the window, they could hear the front door being broken down. Andrew's men were no longer pretending to follow the law. Daniel carefully opened the window and helped Grace through. The night air was cold, sharp, but adrenaline kept her warm. Once they were both outside, he held her hand tightly and led her toward the line of trees that marked the edge of the forest. Behind them, they could hear shouts of frustration as the men discovered the empty house. "This way," Daniel whispered, guiding her down a path he seemed to know well. As they ran through the darkness, branches scratching at their clothes and roots threatening to trip them at every step, Grace understood she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. She was choosing love over safety, freedom over social acceptance, Daniel over Andrew, and for the first time in months, despite the fear and uncertainty, she felt truly alive. "Where are we going?" she asked when they stopped to catch their breath in a small clearing. Daniel looked at her, and even in the darkness she could see the smile on his face. "Away from here. Anywhere we can be together." The answer was both insufficient and perfect. They had no plan, no certain destination, no guarantees. They had only each other and the fragile hope that it would be enough. But as she watched Daniel check the stars to guide their escape, Grace felt that maybe, just maybe, it was. Dawn found Grace and Daniel exhausted, walking along a little used road that wound through hills covered in morning mist. His clothes were torn by the forest branches, and both their faces were marked with small scratches, but they were alive and free, for now. "We need to find shelter," Daniel said, watching the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, "and food and horses, if possible." Grace nodded, aware that their hasty escape had left them with minimal resources. The small satchel she'd brought contained only a few coins and her father's ring. It wasn't enough to sustain two fugitives for long. "There's a town a few miles from here," she said, remembering old trips with her father. "Small, but it has an inn. Maybe we can—" "No," Daniel interrupted gently. "Inns are the first place they'll look for us. We need to avoid anywhere they take names or ask questions." The reality of their situation began to press down on Grace with full force. They were fugitives now, forced to live in the shadows, always looking over their shoulders. The freedom she had felt the night before was quickly being tempered by the awareness of the sacrifices it demanded. They found refuge in a small cave, hidden among rocks on a steep hillside. Daniel found it almost by chance, and when they ducked inside, they discovered it was larger than it looked, with enough space for two people to lie down comfortably. "Have you been here before?" Grace asked, noticing how familiar he seemed with the place. "When I was a boy," he answered, gathering twigs for a small fire. "I used to hunt rabbits in these hills with my father. We knew these trails well." Grace watched him work, admiring the natural competence with which he turned an empty space into something almost habitable. It was a skill she had never needed to develop, raised as she was among servants who took care of all of life's practical needs. "Daniel," she said after he had the fire going, "what are we going to do? Where are we going?" He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, but maintaining a respectful distance. "We have a few options," he said, his voice thoughtful. "We could try to reach the border of the next territory. There you'd be just another refugee, not a fugitive. Or we could look for a mission that might give us temporary sanctuary. And after that? After that, we improvise." The raw honesty of his answer made her smile in spite of everything. It was exactly the kind of planning Andrew would never tolerate, based more on hope than on careful strategy. "There's a third option," she said after a moment of reflection. "What's that?" "We could go back, face the consequences. Maybe if I marry Andrew—" "No." Daniel's interruption was so firm it startled her. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself like that. But if it's the only way to ensure your safety—" Daniel turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his eyes made her heart race. "Grace, listen to me. I would rather be hanged as an outlaw than live knowing you're trapped in a marriage you hate. I would rather die free than live as a coward." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, not for their harshness, but for the absolute truth they carried. Daniel wasn't just protecting her out of duty. He was fighting for something much deeper and more personal. "Why are you doing this for me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because you changed everything for me," he answered, reaching out to touch her face lightly. "Before I met you, I lived to serve men who barely knew my name. I fought for causes I didn't understand, protected people who saw me as a useful tool. But you reminded me why honor is worth having, why it's worth fighting." Grace closed her eyes and leaned into his hand, letting herself enjoy the comforting touch. "What if we're making a terrible mistake? What if we regret it?" he finished for her. "We find out that love isn't enough to face the world?" "Yes." Daniel leaned closer and Grace could feel his warm breath against her skin. "Then at least we will have tried. At least we will have lived one moment of truth in a world full of lies." This time, when he leaned in to kiss her, Grace didn't pull away. The kiss was gentle, hesitant at first, as if he were afraid of breaking her with his touch. But when she responded, pressing her lips against his with a hunger she didn't know she possessed, all hesitation vanished. They kissed like people who had waited an eternity for this moment, like fugitives stealing happiness from the minutes they had left. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. "I love you," Daniel whispered against her lips. "I love you more than life itself." "I love you too," she answered, the words coming out like a confession torn from her soul. "God help me, I love you too." It was then that they heard the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats. Daniel immediately pulled away from her and moved to the mouth of the cave, peering cautiously through the rocks. What he saw made his blood run cold. "How many?" Grace asked, seeing the tension in his shoulders. "Too many," he answered grimly. "And they know this area well. They're on our trail." Grace felt panic rise in her throat, but forced herself to stay calm. She had learned, in the recent months of adversity, that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "What do we do?" Daniel returned to her side, and Grace could see he was already forming a plan in his mind. "They can't bring the horses up here. They'll have to come on foot, and that gives us some advantage. But we can't stay here." "Is there another way out?" "There's a fissure in the rocks at the back that leads to the other side of the hill. It's narrow and dangerous, but it's our only chance." Grace looked at the opening he indicated. It was indeed narrow, barely more than a crack in the rock. The thought of squeezing through it terrified her, but the alternative was far worse. "I'll go first," Daniel said, beginning to work his way into the fissure. "If I can get through, you follow me." Grace watched him gradually disappear between the rocks, her heart pounding so hard she was sure their pursuers could hear it. It felt like hours until she heard his voice, muffled but clear, from the other side. "Come on, Grace." "Slowly, but come on." She took a deep breath and started to squeeze through the opening. The stone scraped her clothes and skin, and at times she was sure she would be trapped there forever. But Daniel's strong hands guided her from the other side, pulling her gently until she finally emerged into the daylight. They were on the other side of the hill now, temporarily hidden from their pursuers, but they both knew it was only a temporary reprieve. "We can't keep running forever," Grace said, looking down at the valley that stretched below them. "No," Daniel agreed, "but we can run long enough to find a better solution, or to have a chance to live, even if it's just for a little while longer." Grace held his hand tightly and nodded. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she would face anything by the side of the man she loved. It was both very little and everything at once. Together they began the descent down the steep slope toward a future that was uncertain, but of their own choosing. 3 days of running had turned Grace and Daniel into unrecognizable versions of themselves. His sturdy clothes were reduced to rags, while her dress was so torn and dirty that any trace of her former life had vanished. But in their eyes shone something that hadn't been there before, the deep understanding that they had chosen each other above everything else in the world. They found temporary shelter in an abandoned logger's cabin in a dense forest far from the main roads. The roof leaked in several places, but the walls were solid enough to protect them from the biting wind that announced winter's arrival. "We can't go on like this," Grace said, watching Daniel examine their dwindling supplies. "We're just prolonging the inevitable." Daniel looked up from the small pile of hardtack and dried jerky that made up their entire store of food. "What are you suggesting?" "That maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting." The firmness in her voice surprised him. During their days on the run, he had watched her gradually transform. The protected heiress was giving way to a determined woman, forged by hardship. "Fight how?" "Against the entire court, against Andrew and all his allies." Grace moved closer and knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. "Fight with the truth. Fight for justice. Fight by showing the world what kind of man Andrew really is. Grace, you're talking about directly confronting one of the most powerful men in the territory. That's suicide?" she finished with an ironic smile. "Daniel, we're living like hunted animals. That's already a kind of death. At least if we fight openly, we'll die as human beings." Her logic was both impeccable and terrifying. Daniel knew she was right, but he also knew that what she was proposing would put them in mortal danger. "And how do you plan to do that? Just show up at the courthouse and accuse Andrew of conspiracy?" "Something like that," she said, a determined light in her eyes he had never seen before. "But first, I need your ring." Daniel stared at her, not understanding. "My ring?" "Your service ring. Your symbol of honor." Confused but trusting, Daniel removed the simple iron ring that marked his military service and handed it to her. Grace held it for a moment, examining the modest insignia that adorned it. "There's something I didn't tell you about my father," she said finally. "Something Andrew doesn't know, that no one knows but me." "What?" "My father kept detailed ledgers of all his financial transactions, ledgers that show exactly how our debts were incurred and manipulated, and more importantly, ledgers that show who really benefited from them." Daniel felt his heart quicken. "Are you saying that—" "I'm saying my father suspected Andrew for years. He suspected he was manipulating debts and favors to weaken our family, and he documented everything." "Where are these documents?" Grace smiled, and there was something almost fierce in her expression. "In a place Andrew would never think to look, in the crypt of the church where we met with him." The audacity of the plan left Daniel speechless for a moment. The idea that the very place where Andrew had tried to manipulate her held the evidence of his corruption had an almost poetic symmetry. "How can we retrieve those documents? The whole town must be watched." "That's where your ring comes in," Grace said, handing it back to him. "You're going to go back alone. As a veteran, you have the right to present yourself to the judge and request a formal hearing." "Grace, that's insane. They'll arrest me the moment they see me." "Not if you present yourself as a man blinded by my undue influence who now wishes to do the right thing." The suggestion hit him like a slap. "You want me to betray you? To pretend that—" "I want you to pretend that you've come to your senses and realized that helping a fugitive was a mistake, that you now wish to cooperate with the authorities in exchange for leniency." Daniel stood abruptly, pacing nervously around the small cabin. "I won't do it. I won't pretend I regret loving you." Grace stood as well and held his shoulders firmly. "It wouldn't be pretending, Daniel. It would be strategy, the only way to get the evidence we need." "And what if it goes wrong? What if they don't believe me? What if—" "If it goes wrong, at least we tried. And if it works, we'll have a chance to expose Andrew publicly, to clear my name and what? Go back to your old life. You'll recover your titles and property while I go back to being a landless man serving a lady who barely knows my name." The question revealed Daniel's deepest fear, the terror that even if they defeated Andrew, Grace would realize she had fallen for him only in adversity, that their love wouldn't survive a return to stability. Grace held his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Daniel Ashford, do you really think that after everything we've been through, after I chose you over safety, I would just go back to my old life as if nothing happened?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice thick with vulnerability. "I don't know what kind of woman you'll be when you don't need me to survive anymore." "Then let me show you what kind of woman I am," she said, moving closer until their lips almost touched. "I am the woman who chose love over convenience, who chose truth over appearances, who chose you over everything else." She kissed him then, pouring all her passion and determination into the kiss. When they parted, they were both breathing heavily. "We'll do this together," she said. "You go back to town, get the ledgers, and then we face Andrew together, as partners, as equals." Daniel closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The plan was dangerous, almost impossible, but it was the only chance they had to rewrite their destinies. "What if I'm arrested before I can even speak to the judge? Then I will go for the documents myself and face Andrew alone." The absolute determination in her voice convinced him she wasn't bluffing. Grace would do exactly as she said, regardless of the risks. "All right," he said finally, "we'll try. But if something goes wrong, if I don't come back—" "You will come back," she interrupted, "because now we have something to fight for that's worth more than our own lives. We have a future together." Daniel nodded, allowing himself to believe, for the first time in days, that it might be possible, that they might actually win. "How long do you need?" he asked. 2 hours to get to the church, retrieve the documents and get back, plus an hour for a safety margin." "And if I'm not back in 3 hours?" Grace hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Then I'll assume you're dead or captured, and I'll proceed with the plan alone." The practical coldness of her answer impressed him. The Grace he had first met was emotional, impulsive. This Grace was calculating, prepared for the worst-case scenario. Adversity had turned her into a strategist. "I need to leave now," he said, checking the sun's position through the broken window. "If I'm going to present myself as a repentant man, I need to arrive before nightfall." Grace nodded and kissed him one last time, long and deep. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you too," he answered, "and I'll prove it by coming back with the evidence we need." Daniel picked up his sidearm and went to the door. When he turned for one last look, Grace was standing in the center of the cabin, her chin held high in defiance, and he knew he had fallen in love with the most extraordinary woman in the world. Now he just had to survive long enough to build a life with her. As she watched Daniel disappear into the trees, Grace felt a cold fear settle in her stomach. She was betting everything on a desperate plan, but it was better than passively accepting defeat. For the first time since her father's death, she felt truly in control of her own destiny, and she was ready to fight tooth and nail to protect it. Daniel reached the town gates as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline of knowing the next few minutes would determine whether he and Grace had a future together or if it would all end in tragedy. The guards recognized him immediately, their hands moving to their guns. But Daniel raised his in a sign of surrender. "I've come to turn myself in," he said, his voice filled with a humility that took great effort to feign, "and to bring information on the whereabouts of the fugitive Grace Rosehill." The mention of Grace's name made the guards hesitate. After a few minutes of whispered discussion, one of them ran off toward the center of town, clearly to report the situation. Half an hour later, Daniel was being escorted through the familiar streets, watched by curious and hostile eyes. News of his return had already spread, and small groups of people formed on street corners to watch him pass. The courthouse was lit by lanterns, and when Daniel entered the main hall, he found not only Stephen Miller but also Andrew, both with expressions that mixed satisfaction and suspicion. "Mr. Ashford," Stephen Miller said, leafing through some papers. "What an interesting change of heart. A few days ago you seemed willing to die for the fugitive's honor. A few days ago I was blinded by an improper affection," Daniel replied, forcing shame into his voice. "Time in the woods, running like an animal, made me realize the foolishness of my actions." Andrew approached, studying Daniel with calculating eyes. "And where is Miss Rosehill now?" "Hiding in a logger's cabin in the West Woods, about a 2-hour ride. She's waiting for me to return with supplies." "Very convenient," Andrew murmured. "And why should we believe this isn't a trap?" Daniel met his eyes without flinching. "Because I have nothing left to gain by protecting her, sir. I've lost my honor, my reputation, any chance of future service. All I have left is the possibility of leniency in exchange for my cooperation." Stephen Miller nodded thoughtfully. "And what information can you offer us besides her location?" This was the opening Daniel had been waiting for. He took a deep breath and plunged into the riskiest part of his plan. "Miss Rosehill has documents. Documents she believes can compromise Mr. Blackmoor and clear her own name." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Andrew visibly stiffened, while Stephen Miller leaned forward, intrigued. "What kind of documents?" "Financial ledgers left by her father. She believes they can prove her family's debts were artificially manipulated." Andrew laughed, but there was a forced note in the sound. "The delusions of a desperate woman. Even if such documents existed, they would prove nothing but her father's administrative incompetence." But Daniel could see the nervousness in the tycoon's eyes. There was something there, a real fear behind the confident facade. "Where are these supposed documents?" Stephen Miller asked. "She hid them in the church crypt, under a specific gravestone. I believe it was her grandfather's. It was a carefully constructed lie. The church would be searched, but it would give Grace time to retrieve the real documents and prepare her revelation." "Why are you telling us this?" Andrew asked suspiciously. "Because I want this to be over, sir. I want her to accept the reality of her situation and stop fighting the inevitable. And because I hope my cooperation will be considered when it comes time to determine my punishment." Stephen Miller and Andrew exchanged a meaningful glance. "Very well," the judge said finally. "You will lead us to the cabin where she is hiding, and some men will check the church to retrieve these documents. There's one condition," Daniel said, betting high. "I want to be present when she is arrested. I want her to hear from my own mouth why I betrayed her. She needs to understand that our connection was a mistake." Andrew smiled cruelly. "You want to humiliate her personally? Interesting. Very well, that will be allowed." Daniel nodded, feigning satisfaction, while inside his heart was breaking. He was about to betray Grace in a way he hoped she would understand, but it would still be one of the hardest things he had ever done. An hour later, a small posse left town in 2 directions. A larger group headed for the West Woods in search of Grace, while a smaller group went to check the church. Daniel rode beside Andrew, maintaining a grimly determined expression. When they reached the spot where he had indicated Grace was hiding, a genuinely abandoned cabin he knew of but not where she was. They found the place empty, just as Daniel had expected. "Where is she?" Andrew snarled, his patience gone. "I don't know," Daniel answered, allowing genuine confusion to show. "She said she would wait for me here. Maybe she suspected something and ran again." It was then that the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of messengers from town. Daniel's heart raced when he saw the dark expressions on the newcomers' faces. "Sir," one of the riders said, addressing Andrew, "the church has been searched. We didn't find any documents, but what? But we found Miss Rosehill there. She was waiting for us." Daniel felt the world spin. Grace had anticipated his move and decided to act alone, deliberately putting herself in danger to protect him. "Where is she now?" Andrew demanded. "In custody at the courthouse, sir, but there's a problem. She's insisting on speaking publicly, before witnesses. She says she has important revelations to make about irregularities in the administration of her inheritance." Andrew's face paled slightly. It was exactly the kind of public spectacle he wanted to avoid. "And the documents?" "She has them, sir. She says she will only hand them over in exchange for a fair and public trial." Daniel closed his eyes, finally understanding the full extent of Grace's plan. She had not only found the evidence they needed, she was using it as leverage to force exactly the kind of public confrontation Andrew feared. "We're going back," Andrew ordered, his voice thick with contained fury. "We'll put an end to this farce once and for all." As they rode back to town, Daniel felt a mixture of admiration and terror. Grace was betting everything on a bold move, trusting that he would find a way to join her at the crucial moment. Now he just had to figure out how to do it, without destroying them both in the process. The coming trial would decide not only their fate, but the future of any possibility of justice in a world governed by men like Andrew Blackmoor. And for the first time since he had begun his charade of betrayal, Daniel genuinely smiled. Grace had found a way to turn their apparent defeat into their best chance at final victory.